The word manga itself has a comical inclination, I do agree. Google's definition says it is collection of whimsical pictures. Whimsical, I don't know about that. Now look, I am not a big manga guy. I have only read a couple of handfuls. However, the ones I have read, I can guarantee that they were anything but whimsical. And also, I'm not against self help books. I think they are great. However, I do agree that they lack substance. You can't easily connect to them, or if you connect, they are highly forgetful if you don't put them in practice. And since we are talking about substance, the manga starts with the life of young Musashi before he was this massive global phenomenon of a name. He joins the Battle of Sekigahara, which was essentially a civil war in medieval Japan around year 1600, and the factions were West versus East. Naturally, Musashi ended up surviving the battle along with his friend Matahachi. Now, here is where the diversion occurs. Musashi, because he survives this massive battle, of course, decided to be the strongest samurai to ever exist. And on the other hand, Matahachi also shares the same dream. However, he ended up making poor decisions, chose comfort, chose women, and thus he ended up in his sorry state of a life. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Musashi pursued his journey of destruction of ego and how he decided to be a person who has nothing to prove despite his immense strength. Matahachi, who had a life to return to, a family, a fiance, ended up losing everything because of his choices. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Musashi, who was a reckless outcast, ended up gaining a lot. The story in itself is so enriched. Now, when it comes to the author, honestly, I don't get how people can actually draw things out of their mind, piece of paper, and said to depict what you have in your mind. I would probably end up drawing something bizarre. And anyway, so the author Takehiko Inoue also worked on a famous piece of work called Slam Dunk, which is apparently finished, unlike Vagabond. But Vagabond seems to be based on more realistic environment. However, the author himself says that the Slam Dunk, which is based on basketball, and Vagabond, which is based on samurai, has similarities inherently within themselves because none of them loves losing. Vagabond in itself feels a little protagonist based. However, I don't think it's a bad thing because characters do pop out in the story while the main focus is on Musashi. For however, this pattern changes for few volumes when it's a different character, which we'll talk about later. The character pops, it makes us, the readers, learn a lesson and serve their purpose and disappear to repeat the pattern again. In his pursuit of becoming the master swordsman, Musashi decides to visit Kyoto at the age of 21 to challenge the Yoshioka school of sword fighting, which was run by the two brothers. Now, the dynamic of the two brothers was very well elaborated in the manga, and it was always depicted that how the older one is much much stronger than the younger one, and they were more or less depicted as Seijuro being the brain of the Yoshioka and Denshichiro being the heart of the Yoshioka. Apparently, their father, Yoshioka Kempo, decides that Seijuro will be the head. However, later it is revealed that Denshichiro was the more fitted one to be the head. In the later volumes, it was briefly mentioned how Denshichiro, being less ruthless than his brother, was the obvious reason why he was weaker. And so apparently what would happen is if Denshichiro isn't in a fair fight, we saw it when he fought a younger Sasaki Kojiro. And since Kojiro was already injured, he tries injuring himself as well, so it's a fair fight. And apparently, according to manga, this was his character trait which couldn't make him grow as strong as Seijuro. I think it was so well written that the lack of ruthlessness is itself his strength as well and his weakness as well. Makes you think in real life as well that maybe being less ruthless or overly kind is what actually making you less, not physically strong, but maybe mentally strong, and limiting your ways of living to a certain extent. Ability to say no, they say, is very important to have in life. This phase acts as the center point of the entire story, where the young Musashi thinks being unmatched in sheer strength is the way to become invincible, to be the absolute best in the world. Nobody can challenge you or defeat you. And this is what was his ambition in the start of the manga, to become so strong, defeat everybody he sees or even encounters as somewhat decent samurai. He wishes to defeat them all. We see how Musashi's ambition to become invincible drastically changes as the story progresses. Along with the readers themselves, invincible or being invincible is not just an idea anymore. It's an illusion where Musashi learns that strength is not just dominating others in physical fight, but rather mastering oneself, shredding the ego, and training your mind to an absolute level where nothing can catch you off guard and you can tackle everything. You accept your weakness just as it is and try to work towards it. The manga establishes the idea that invincible is just a word pretty early. It was by Yagyu something, I guess. I don't remember his name. And it's left for viewers and Musashi to ponder upon this sentence for a long time, how you evolve with the idea itself. In his conquest to become invincible, Musashi challenges the Hosoin Temple and their second generation master, Inshun Hosoin. Now, this fight is incredibly written because it serves as a metamorphosis of the character of Miyamoto Musashi. The fight happens in two stages. The first, Inshun wins so incredibly, a man who doesn't run from a 1 versus 70, but actually ends up running from a 1v1. That's how strong Inshun was, and that's how weak, well, technically not weak, but inexperienced Musashi was in the initial stages. Now, after, or I think it was before the fight itself, Musashi had a brief encounter with the father or the first generation master of the Hosoin Temple, Ine, aka the Great Ine, and he tells him how his gaze is so bloodthirsty and there is no grace in the way he approaches people, which makes them inherently their enemy, or do not people do not prefer to be friends with him. And I guess it serves out to be true in the initial parts of the manga itself. Another great thing about the character of Inshun was his ability to still fear in Musashi during their first face off, because Musashi actually ended up running from this battle, the first one. Now, I know it is uncharacteristic of him because in the later part of the story, he actually didn't run even while facing off 70 samurais. Although this was an early part of the story, I still think it was odd for the character of Musashi to run like this, because we literally don't see him run away before any major battle before this, and definitely not after this. But I still think it's justified because it was a new experience for him. We can see how by their second face off, when Musashi had become somewhat strong because of the teachings of Ine, and we see they, instead of fighting, they just end up staring at each other for a very, very long time, which looked kind of odd but wasn't actually for both of them. In the first face off, Musashi ends up so scared, or maybe scared is not the right word, of Inshun's gaze, which completely got reversed in the second battle. It was now Inshun who was so alerted by the gaze of Musashi. Dynamics completely changed in the two face-offs against the same opponent. The way Takehiko Inoue described the near-death experience of Inshun in this battle was so incredibly done, and it shows how both Musashi and Inshun ended up learning a lesson from this fight, each in their own way. When we get introduced to the character of Otsu in the beginning of the story as the fiance of Matahachi, she felt a little insignificant. However, we realize that she actually serves the purpose of being a love interest of Musashi. How their symbol of unconditional love goes both ways, because how the story makes it clear that they both love each other. However, for Musashi, the way of the sword is final and definitive, and is his priority. Now, Musashi struggles with the feelings of love, and he mistakes it as a distraction, of course. Now, we get a panel of dialogue with Takuan and Musashi, and how he explains him or make him realize that instead of being distracted by these feelings, which will obviously make you contained or repress you, much better to turn those feelings into the purpose of living and let Otsu be the emotional anchor and a reason to live beyond the mere life of just violence. The ultimate message is to have something or someone to just look forward to besides your actual purpose. Now, this is the panel of Musashi we get after this conversation, and it's pretty clear what the author actually wanted to convey through this small arc. We get glimpses of the live and present doctrine of Vagabond during the Battle of 70 Men, where if Musashi, even for a second, ended up swaying his mind over something, he would die and everything would end for him. Now, again, we see in the volumes of Sasaki Kojiro where there was this random guy who was fighting him, and he ended up saying how the birds do not think of flying before they fly. And I thought this was such a beautiful line and depicted so much of what the character essentially has to say. And it matches Kojiro's personality so much because in the end, he can't speak for himself. He has nothing to lie, unlike Matahachi. He lives a life of authenticity, and that is why perhaps we see him enjoying every moment and how people ends up liking him so much. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Musashi in his early phases remains constantly on edge, which hampers his ability to make social connections with people, and that is what Takuan decides to correct on his part, which is don't be preoccupied and experience everything as a whole. If you divert from your mind, the sword becomes false and you won't be able to win a single battle. This is highly depicted by the ego depiction of Musashi and this weird creature, which he ends up correcting in the farming arc. We can see how Musashi tries to get over and idea of defeating everything by assimilating with the process of nature itself. He can't defeat nature, so he learns to move with it. He learns that by enjoying just mundane tasks like farming, of course, it's because the arc is farming, but even as simple as eating or breathing and living in the moment and helping others help you to be invincible rather than a life of conquest. It teaches us how to drop the fantasy of tomorrow and enjoy the moment we have. In parts of the story, we see young Musashi saying something along the lines, "This is who I am," or "I am who I am." Now, I think this is an immature way of thinking of a young Musashi because the villagers call him a wild beast and he sort of accepts this reality, which I think he corrects later as he grows older and he tries shedding his ego. According to me, it sits exactly correct with the theory of how you can't be who you truly are unless and until you stop chasing the idea of what you want people to see in you.